In the early 1900s, art had arrived at the Fauvism style after earlier experimentation with the various post-impressionist styles of artists like Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Cézanne. This shows that the Fauvism style was very similar to the post-impressionism style. The Fauvists were a loosely shaped group of artists who shared similar approach to nature, but they had no definitive program. This means that there wasn't an exact template for people to follow and achieve this style. It wasn't like cut and paste for anyone. There was also connections to other styles at the time, the German Expressionists being one of the main connections. There was no direct link between both groups. The Fauvism style is characterized by solid patches of color and clearly defined forms, so it looks very blocky. There was a strong similarity of technique and vision. It was characterized by the early style of the group. The early style being bold and very aggressive when you have a look at it. It was kind of reckless, some would say, and Fauvism also went a step further and introduced the idea of self-expression and individualism. And this was crucial for later art developments because people realized that they could be their own person and do their own thing without having to go behind one certain idea. The artworks in this movement also are said to be sketchy, clumsy, and unfinished. The spectator identifies the form to be right, but the color to be wrong. It's a subjective response to nature, and this was represented by bold, undisguised brushstrokes and high-key, vibrant colors that come directly from the tube. The simplified forms and color emphasized the flatness of the canvas and were tools for the immediate visual impressions that needed to be strong and unified. It was Henri Matisse that rejected the traditional three-dimensional picture space, instead making it purposely appear flat and pretty basic so you can just focus on everything going on. The exciting handling of color is not enough to itself to characterize the movement. It was much more than color, but vision and interpretation. It was about the thinking and planning of what was going on. It was the senses of the artists that make up the art. It wasn't about anything else but their interpretation and what comes to them as an artist and their senses. The painters used their mediums not to describe situations, but to express emotions. It was mainly about the color and the representation of the meaning behind every color in the painting rather than how it was laid out. It wasn't their recklessness. No. The use of materials and color had a significance of expressing emotion rather than what's actually going on in the picture. It's a state of mind that comes over a person when they look at these Fauvism paintings. It's the emotion that is represented in the color rather than reality. The radiance of colors is not from their intensity on the palette, but the arrangement on the canvas. How they're sort of not in the right places is what makes them intense and bold to those looking at it. As it was originally used as an insult, critic Louis Vauxelles said the following: Donatello ches les fauves, meaning among the wild beasts, and was used as a term for the painters. And ever since then, this joke or insult was used as the Fauvism name. They're called the wild beasts, stemming from that reason. It was at the beginning of the Romantic period when we see a transformation in the view of nature and objects. People wanted a new language and wanted to revolt, and they heard lots of support. There was many different people at the end of the 19th century that began to want to think a new way. There was the discoveries of Darwin, the Freudian research, and new developing philosophical thoughts. This revolt against rationalism and objective reality of the previous Renaissance perspective was quite moving into why the Fauvism movement came to be what it was. The traditional art rules were no longer there for people. There was advances of post-impressionists in color, symbolism, subject, expressive line, paint application, and this newfound knowledge of irrational and primitive art by African tradition emerged Fauvism as the result of people revolting against the reality or rational thoughts and logical thinking. It was made known that Matisse insisted on discipline and differentiated the genuine creators of the movement from their followers, who merely just added color and to whatever they would like, and they were behaving more like dyers rather than painters. Nobody could really replicate the style. Also said by Matisse that what prevents Gauguin from being assimilated to the Fauves is his failure to use color for constructing space and his use of it as a means of expressing sentiment. As the style developed in the Fauvist movement, towards the end of Matisse's career, his paintings just got bolder and messier. Composition is the art of arranging in a decorative manner of the various elements at the painter's disposal for the expression of his feelings. Matisse said this because the art of composition wasn't only for the view of the reader or everyday person, it was for the artist's own expression of feelings. And artistic expression was one of the major focuses of the Fauvists. Like I said before, Fauvists didn't paint in 3 dimensions, but when they did, they didn't show very much depth in those paintings, even then. More about how Fauvist paintings were constructed. The artist aimed not so much at transporting the scene before them as recreating it differently by simplifying its structure and overseeing the local tones. They usually took the main color or tone that came over them and stood out over all the other ones and made that a main color of the painting, even if it didn't fit in some of the places that it was being placed. These paintings didn't have a lot of details, and Matisse once said that there's a state of mind created by the objects around me, influencing me all the way from the horizon up to myself. So it's kind of like a collective picture that influences the artists in front of them. It was usual that Fauvists painted traditional objects and landscapes. Ongoing about the tones again, there's a necessary proportion of tones, and that is why people imagine that my picture has completely changed when, after a series of modifications, red has replaced green as the dominant color. That was said by Matisse. And that's how he felt people looked at his paintings. Color was governed by the imagination, not by reality. And it was with both metaphorical and space-creating powers. The color process is imagined and received by the artist and influenced them to create the products that they did that were so amazing to viewers like us. Some more about the connections to other movements around this time. Fauvism was very close to German Expressionism, which is also called Die Bruch. They both relied on color to communicate intense rather than the outer world perception that the picture created. German Expressionism, though, was considered darker than Fauvism. Feelings were less optimistic, shown through cold shades. Fauvism tended to be very bright and cheerful, while it is said that German Expressionism was dark and cold. Other differences of these two movements through the use of color to interpret the whole and rarely outlined shapes with lines. There was a new development in the 1920s called Neo-Fauvism. The ideas were never defined or historically accounted for, but it was concurrent to Surrealism and had similarities to Fauvism. Most of the artists of Neo-Fauvism gained no recognition in art history, since what they did was nothing especially new. There was also a group called the Neo-Expressionists who emerged in the 1980s and were also called the New Fauvs. What really broke the barrier for the Fauvists was the Salon d'Automne exhibition for the Fauvs. That is where they made their debut. That's where they made their name, or at least tried to. It was the November 4th issue of a popular Paris weekly, reproduced on a special page featuring what the editor regarded as the most preposterous exhibits. Among them pictures by Rouault, Derain, Valtat, and Minguin from this exhibit. The Salon d'Automne appeared in 1905, and Vlamnik was not one of the artists that was heavily criticized. In his early works, he was more tame and less aggressive than in his later works in the movement. The open window and, above all, Woman with a Hat dumbfounded the critics and enraged the public. It branded Matisse as the ringleader of an art revolution. The public didn't really react well to this movement, and people finally accepted the movement and the artists were establishing themselves. At last, after years of the inevitable struggle for recognition, the Fauvs found their pictures fetching good prices from people who wanted to buy their paintings. They were held in many exhibitions over the year, like Salon de Independance in 1907, where the main attraction was what was called the Fauvism. The opening of Salon de Independance, where the joy of life overshadowed all other exhibits, and established Matisse without a rival as the king of the Fauves. In 1906, Matisse had a one-man show that shadowed all other works. Towards the end of the Fauvist movement, it was never a consistent style or group, but rather a name for the moment in time, in which a few great minds who thought alike found themselves together at the same time and in the same place. Perhaps the emotional flow was just too strong not to be represented in other ways, which could be one of the reasons why the movement didn't last longer and why it had no official theories behind it. Fauvism was a brief yet intense stream of inspiration for movements and styles that emerged in the following years for modern art. For a majority of the artists, this period was a transitional stage and ended up projecting its emotional aspect behind Fauvism for the logic of Cubism that came next. A key year in modern art was that Cubism made its entry on the scene, striking across the final ends of Fauvism, and a 1907 exhibition launched art and painting in a new direction. By 1908, people revived interest in Paul Cézanne's vision of the order and structure of nature, and many rejected the emotionalism of Fauvism in favor of Cubism. It was the short-lived movement that transformed everyone into Cubism interest. Fauvism also had a big influence on others. It is best seen through the artists' life stories, which illustrated the Fauvists' meandering paths, as most of them became members of other isms later on in their lives. The simplification brought by Fauvism was influential in many ways, which also makes it kind of hard to see in modern works of art. Since it was so simple, it's hard to make out that it did influence other movements in the future. It's not easy to recognize how much of today's art was directly influenced by Fauvism and how much indirectly, since every style in art seemed to have borrowed a little bit from its predecessor. There was no fine line of influence seen as it connected to other movements. But the influence was most recognized in Cubism. Similarities recognized through the fact that most Fauvists became members of Cubism after the movement had ended. The Fauvist stains and dots look like they were simply transfigured into polyhedral shapes in Cubism. There was no big difference in the two art movements and flowed together quite well.